Okay, the last extended thing, I'm not going to get into this, the last one I want to look at is another consequence of this. Once we've got all these different languages and cultures, you've got to build new competent inhabitants. You've got to build people who can understand Mandarin, people can understand English. You've got to build, people who know how to fly airplanes. I don't. You've got to build in academic fields. You've got a weird group of people that know what adjacency pair means or what accumulative action means, and that's not something that... So in all these fields, the issue is that you're going to have to build competent inhabitants, people who understand the world in just the ways that make it possible to accomplish the activities of a particular community, like speakers of a language, speakers of a particular scientific community, etc. And what I want to argue, what this has been argued, and I think this is true, that pedagogy is as unique and universal for human beings as language. The only thing I would object to slightly is I don't think it's just pedagogy in the sense of all of us sitting here in a classroom or something. I think that it's built into the organization of action itself. And what I'm trying to argue is that pedagogy is another one of the systematic consequences of the cooperative organization of action. You're going to accumulate. The accumulation is going to lead rather quickly to great diversity, so that every community faces the task of constructing new inhabitants. Why we got a university here, to build new chemists, conversation analysts, people in Asian languages, etc. Every community is facing that particular task. And the way I would differ from pedagogy is that it can use but doesn't require a separate mechanism, but it can be found within the endogenous organization of cooperative action itself. So I'm maybe slight repeat, but I want to make the point. Every community is faced with the ongoing task of building skilled, knowing actors, but simultaneously the distinctive objects that populate its environment. Maps for archaeologists and geologists, whatever. Structure in the water for oceanographers. Adjacency pairs and third pair repair initiators for conversation analysts, etc. You're simultaneously building these phenomenal objects and actors capable of recognizing and working with those objects, and that's the task that everyone performs. Now I want to look at how this is done in local action. I will play this. I can if you want. No, I can't. So you won't. Okay, this is in the midst of surgery. This is very high level education. You've already got the person learning here is a skilled surgeon. But what's happening here is the thing that defines surgery, and I would define identity as practice. So what defines surgery is the ability to skillfully cut living human flesh, and to cut it in the way that will help rather than harm the patient. And all that's happening in this little sequence is that this tool up here is kind of like a scalpel, a cautery, but it's a scalpel that can be heated like a soldering iron. And the reason you do that is that if you heat a blood vessel, but by having a hot tool, you're going to melt the ends of the blood vessel, and you're going to seal it, so you don't have a whole bunch of bleeding. So you've got this knife here. And then what you do is you hold up with a little pair of tweezers, it's called mosquito. You hold up the flesh to be cut, and then you cut it. Okay, so a real simple, really, really simple action. Even those of us who aren't surgeons can understand it. But it turns out that action is being performed by two actors in different positions. The person doing the cutting is the new surgeon, and that's what we may think is going on. But the person who's lifted up the correct piece of flesh is the older, skilled surgeon. He's the one that's located the place that has to be cut. So you're learning how to cut, but more crucially, how to see relevant structure, to navigate inside the human body by working cooperatively with another skilled practitioner. And I think that's the essence of human education in the traditional way. Now, one of the most basic things, I just kind of like this little movie, I'll play it. One of the most basic things posed for human beings and human communities, what is it? So let's look at this. This is archaeologists and geologists. What kind of thing is that? And let me just play this. Okay. Oh, I want to make it louder. Just a sec. Oh, it's loud. That's okay. Okay, let's go.
What's mineralogy here?
So what are you guys seeing?
What is this thing we've got here? So what would this be?
Okay, one of the most basic questions of human beings. What is it? Okay, so again, I'm going to repeat, but I want to look a little more detail. So every community is facing with the task of constructing the answer to that question. What is it? Or within the community, the distinctive objects that make up the phenomenal environment being scrutinized. So here we're looking at geologists, and what they've got, the objects they've got are both categories, like rock categories like quartz or muscovite or clay, and they also build maps and diagrams. And I'll note that Mick, who's sitting here, is doing quite brilliant work analyzing these processes for his PhD dissertation. So you've got the categories are, again, Persian symbols, types, formal abstract categories that have to be recognized through agreement. And the types themselves are not sensory objects. That, you know, it's like the phoneme ta. Ta as an abstract phoneme doesn't exist in the world. It's a distinction that we recognize. And the maps are not iconic diagrams, but models of relevant processes. So what you're trying to show on maps are things like faults and things like that, rather than just a photo. And at the same time, you've got to build, in addition to building the objects that are the source of your science or whatever, you've also got to build actors. And to do that, you're going to have to build human bodies that can transform the objects, their sensory experience of the objects they encounter, into the relevant categories. We'll look at it with geologists. You might be able to say it. You've got conversation analysts who can listen to a big of talk and transform that listening again into adjacency pairs or something else. But I think it's more clear here with the geologists in types. So you've got to build actors, or what I will say is inhabitants, because these actors are all lodged within specific communities that are capable of recognizing abstract types through sensory encounters, through their embodied experience of the qualities found within complex objects that they're working with. And in this sense, another crucial thing is that both objects and actors emerge and are shaped to be what they are through time. If you look at all of the stuff in psychology, etc., Tomasello, etc., you're always going to find things without taking time seriously into account. Do people have mental states? Is there a theory of mind? This, that, and the other. Can you recognize? And at least in this thing, the whole perspective is the unfolding organization through time, which makes it possible to incrementally operate on the contributions of others. So we'll look at this sequence. And what's happening here is these are student geologists. They're really doing work in Yellowstone. And one of the things, they're redrawing a map. They're trying to test out the accuracy of an earlier map and transforming it. And one of the things they've been looking for and alerted to look for is muscovite, because muscovite will be a diagnostic category that will indicate relevant things. So red over here treats this as a possible instance of muscovite. And let me just say, it isn't the whole rock she's holding is muscovite. Muscovite is a little kind of thing in the midst of that rock. But note she does it as a tentative. She first doesn't just look at the rock. She looks at it as a geological object. She uses a term like muscovite. So she constitutes it what it is for them. And then another person comes in and joins her. White, I'm just talking about the color of their shirts. White comes in and points toward it and says, yeah, I don't know what that is. She's also holding that as only a possibility, a candidate possibility. If you want a liminal object, it hasn't yet been constituted as that category. Then they take it to the professor, the senior geologist. He says, I think there is, and then he says, yeah. And at this point, it has at last been constituted as that kind of an object. Let's take a look at the video. I may have jumped too far forward in this. Let me just bring it up again.
Is there muscovite in this thing?
Yeah, I don't know what that.
I think there is.
Remember, muscovite was one of those things we're looking for.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're seeing that that whole thing of trying to come up with the category is being organized both in the field and socially with others. Now, as you just heard, the senior guy, Darrell, whatever, he says muscovite was one of those things we're looking for. How is that understood? Again, going back to conversation analysis, other things, you understand in terms of a relevant next action. So the woman who initially found it says, so we should take a station here. So she's finding out the relevance of that category for their local course of action. Now, once you've got this, you might figure, okay, you know what it is. it's been said it's muscovite. That's all there is to it. But the most crucial thing here is that the students keep looking at that rock.
So we should take a station from me.
Yeah.
So she grabs the rock, White does, looks at it intensely,
Is it that?
then asks again, is it that? She's no longer asking, is it muscovite, but she's asking what in the rock is actually the instance of muscovite.
Yeah, stuff's really simple.
And he says, yeah, the senior points it out, yes, stuff that's really silvery there. So what she's trying to find out are the sensory characteristics of the rock. What she should look at is sensory features, silvery, etc., in order to be able to transform her sensory experience into the abstract type of muscovite. And I won't go into it more, but notice that he isn't saying it is silver. He's using a term like silvery stuff or something. So he's pointing toward it.
That's muscovite.
Then someone else comes and gets it. Ask again. And you begin to hand around the rock. So the thing I think is really important is that even when they've been told what it is, the students are working with the actual materials in order to gain the skills for their bodies, to sediment into the sensory experience of their bodies the ability to recognize this type. And in this sense then, you're building the sensorium, the perceptual body of a geologist, as a public structure through cooperative action. And here's the more general question that I would come up with, going back to how did symbols emerge in the world? How do, what Peirce argues basically, and you could see this with the difference between, you know, particular sounds in language and the phonemic, if you want, I don't know if the term's still used, but basically, how do you understand the difference between a T and P? How do you transform the sounds you actually hear into relevant sounds within the language? And you could think of those as types. And what Peirce argued, he also said there were legisigns, and that legisigns are always recognized through replicas, examples of a particular type. So we hear different versions of Tom, Ted, or something like that. We hear different versions, and we transform them so all those things are elements of whatever the phonetic distinction of, let's just say, T. Okay, so how is it done? Well, what you've got is perceivable phenomena are treated as installations of a type. And these phenomena are constellations of qualities, such as silvery color. And what you've got to do, what you're doing through this work in the field, is you're entraining bodies to be able to recognize those diverse constellations of qualities as instances of types. So you're regimenting through public practice the embodied experience of newcomers. Just real quick, it's not too important, but a lot of people talk about replicas as the regimentation of replicas into a type. And then there you're looking, and this is common like in French philosophy, you're looking almost entirely in the world of signs. And what I'm thinking, what I want to argue is, prior to the world of signs are the world of bodies able to use those signs. So those signs can only be sustained through action. So you've got to build the capacities of actors able to work with those signs, and you can't focus on signs in isolation from the courses of action that sustain and constitute them. So you regiment experience so that the qualitative sensations of objects can be recognized as replicas of a particular action-relevant type, a consequential phenomenal object. And in this way, we're creating a populated phenomenal world that's not lodged within the psychology of the individual, but instead within a world of perception that's shared imperfectly with other inhabitants. And well, that's okay, probably enough for this. Well, maybe to conclude on this part, and there's only one other little thing. In the very first sentence of Studies in Ethnomethodology, Garfinkel argued every reference to the real world, even when references to physical or biological events, is a reference to the organized activities of everyday life. And here I think we've seen this. We've had a bunch of scientists looking at the world, looking at muscovite, but the only way you can constitute that are through these more basic endogenous practices of human interaction through which you're constructing knowledge. Now, Garfinkel made a second statement at the very first line of his dissertation. And he was talking about Parsons, but of how you'd build a social structure. And he said the other development, not yet adequately exploited, seeks a generalized social system built solely from the analysis of experience structures. So what I've been trying to do in this last little part is look at how experience is transformed into public knowledge, and arguing that the way that's done is through the in situ activities of a community.